The earliest canonical collections, this is of course a term broadly used in religious studies, the earliest canonical collections, that is those collections that were considered to be the most reliable and to include traditions that you could use as a basis of law, right, and you as an ordinary Muslim could completely rely on. So those canonical collections start to be made in the 9th and 10th centuries. That's when they start to be put together. But it was clear, by the time you get to the 9th and the 10th century, the number of reports of things Muhammad had said or done had proliferated to a huge extent, as you can imagine. And Muslim scholars very easily, and by the way, I want to reiterate something that I think I said earlier in one context or another, that this was not a state process. This wasn't the Islamic State putting together these collections. These were independent scholars not aligned with a state who chose to undertake this work, often in addition to doing something else. Right? They might have had a kind of business in the bazaar, and they also did this on the side. So this is something that was undertaken voluntarily by pious Muslims who really devoted their lives to putting these things together. This was not a top-down process. This was a bottom-up process. But these scholars did recognize that indeed there was a lot of material attributed to the Prophet that was almost certainly not valid, right? For a lot of reasons. Sometimes people just liked making up stories. That might be one of them. But more commonly, people were people, right? You know, you transmit a story from one person to another, to another, to another. Errors might creep in. Misunderstandings might creep in. People might forget certain parts. And so there were lots of reasons why all of this material was not necessarily considered valid. So the scholars developed really a quite elaborate system for vetting hadith, for trying to determine which ones were valid and which ones were not. And that process was almost entirely dependent upon an analysis of the isnad, right? So they would look very carefully and scrutinize this isnad. And so if we go back to the other example, right, just because it has more names in it, if we look at this example, if they wanted to determine, and Bukhari obviously did, that this was a legitimate hadith, they would want to make sure that Musaddad and Yahya and Shu'ba and Qatada and Anas were all people of high character. They were people who were good Muslims. They did not hold heretical or unusual views. They were people of piety. They were honest. But they also had to be knowledgeable, to have a good memory, to be never known to have lied. So the first thing you had to do is you had to make sure that everybody in that isnad had both a sound character and the intelligence and the memory to be relied upon to transmit this information. As I said, they also had to make sure that each of these people could have met, right? So if I say to you, Abraham Lincoln told me such and such, right? That would not count as a reliable transmission because there's no possible way, as old as I am, that I could have actually met Abraham Lincoln face to face. Right. But at the same time, if Shu'ba, let's say, lived in Fustat in Egypt, and Qatada lived in Medina, let's say, and neither of them was known to have ever left their native city, also not legitimate. But if they tell us, well, you know, Qatada made a trip to Egypt or Shu'ba made a trip to Medina, then fine. There was at least a possibility that they could have met. They had to have lived at the same time and to have been known to at least possibly reside in the same or be present in the same place at the same time somehow. How do they know all that? There are thousands and thousands of these transmitters. Right? another genre of Islamic literature developed that was basically, it's called Rijal literature. You don't need to know that technical term, of course, but these were biographical encyclopedias, encyclopedic collections where all of the people who were transmitters for known traditions would have an entry. And in that entry, they would tell you whatever they knew about them. They often didn't know birth dates. Sometimes they did, but they would say, let's say he died in such and such a year, and people say he was, about 90 years old or about 60 years old or whatever it was, so that you could kind of work backwards and figure out when roughly he would have been born. They would tell you where he lived and where he traveled. They would tell you who were his close scholarly companions, who did he interact with, who were his teachers, who were his students. What particular kinds of issues was he interested in? Because there were certain people who kind of specialized in hadith about, let's say, prayer, or hadith about that were more sort of eschatological in nature, right? So you might have people who specialized in particular topical issues within the hadith. And all of that would help you determine, first of all, is that person really a good authority? Is this particular isnad or this collection of authorities someone that can be relied upon? So the isnad became kind of a pedigree for oral transmission after oral transmission was no longer really practicable, right? Once these things get written down in books, you don't have people still learn orally. That's still a big thing in the Islamic world, traditional Islamic world. But nonetheless, these start to get written down, right? So we don't have isnads that go all the way to the 21st century, right? All the way back. So it's a stand-in for that oral, that process of oral transmission. Okay, for Sunnis, especially to some extent for Shias, but certainly for Sunnis, it was very important the reliability of a particular hadith, whether it was a direct quote from Muhammad like this or a description of something that he did, would be to have multiple versions with different chains of transmission. Right? So if Muhammad did something and he did it in public, so 15 people saw him and they, let's say 10 of them related it to other people and they related it to other people, you would get a multiplicity of isnads. And so the more isnads, the more different, and sometimes there would be something like this, obviously, there would be slight differences in how it was transmitted. But this gave it a particular standing if it had a large number of people relating the same thing for obvious reasons. Now, what about the content? Did Muslims look at the content of some of this material and decide some of it was legitimate or not legitimate? Not as much, right? It was more, this was the most important form of that critique. But certainly, if you had something that was attributed to the Prophet that directly contradicted something in the Quran, for example, right? Or seemed completely immoral or against all moral sense, such as one would get from the Quran, those would be thrown out, right, as unreliable. Right? But there weren't a whole lot of those. There weren't a whole lot that were of that type.